All right, thanks everyone for joining. We're going to get started. So welcome to our webinar on Intro to Adobe Analytics. For today's webinar, you're joined by both myself and Debbie. So to start off with, we'd like to just begin with some quick introductions. So I'm Charles. I lead our head of innovation over at Adswerve. For those of you who haven't worked or are not familiar with Adswerve, we're both a leading Google Analytics and Adobe provider. And for today's webinar, we're going to be doing a deep dive on Adobe Analytics. I've been with Adswerve for about 10 years. I have a very deep background in Google Analytics, and I've actually been working more on the Adobe side for the past few years. So excited to share some perspective on that with you. And then I'm also joined by Debbie. So Debbie, can you introduce yourself?
Great, thank you. Yes, my name is Debbie Kern. I've been with Adswerve, just joined this year. I've been working with Adobe Analytics since 2006 when it was actually Omniture. So I as well have deep expertise within the Adobe Analytics world.
Yes, so Debbie's going to be walking us through most of our demo today. So I tried to put together the world's shortest slide deck. So I think I only have 3 slides in here. So for today, what we really want to do is we want to kind of set a foundation for why Adobe Analytics is a very valuable tool and can potentially be a really key addition to what you're using. So we're going to talk through kind of a little bit about some of the changes going on within our industry. We're going to spend the vast majority of our time today on a live interactive demo. I always prefer showing the tool versus slideware. So Debbie and I are going to be kind of talking through some fun, exciting things to show from a capability perspective within that platform. And then we're going to save and reserve a fair bit of time at the end. So if you have any questions, you can definitely enter those at any time in the chat, and we'll probably be covering all the questions at the end. In addition, this will be recorded, so if you want to come back and reference any of this, we will be sending out the recording, and we'll also have some additional resources to share with you as well. So that is my deck. So let's go ahead and dive in. So I wanted to start with just kind of an overview of kind of some of the changes in our industry. And in the description of the webinar, we kind of teased that in the past kind of few years, we've been working with lots of clients that are actually using multiple analytics platforms. And there is a lot of changes, both within Google, Adobe, and other providers as well. Google has the new version of Google Analytics they're calling GA4. Adobe actually has a new product called Customer Journey Analytics, which we'll talk through a little bit today, but we'll actually do another webinar on later. But short story is, not only is lots of changes around privacy, browsers, but also some of the technologies and the platforms that many of us use for our kind of core analytics solutions are also changing. And what I like to start is I think there's actually a really good use case where both Adobe and Google can kind of coincide. And in fact, the changes that are happening right now have really made it easier than ever. So previously, if any of you have ever had the opportunity to use both platforms, Google Analytics and Adobe were actually 2 very different platforms. The way you would use them is very different. So actually how you do analysis within the platform. Additionally, how you would set it up and implement it was very different. So kind of the schemas and the taxonomies and a lot of other things. So to start off with, Google has made some significant changes on their side with the GA4 platform. And that's actually made Google Analytics more like Adobe than ever before. And just to show you a simple example of what I mean by that, in Google Analytics, they've kind of changed the way you're supposed to do a lot of your core analysis. So if you're an intermediate or advanced user in Google Analytics, you're likely going to be spending the vast majority of your time in this new area of the product called explorations. And explorations is where you can basically do all of your ad hoc reporting, you can create tables, and you can start to kind of do a variety of what they kind of consider that intermediate and advanced analytics. And I think this is important because as we go through Adobe, this is Adobe Analytics, and Debbie's going to be taking us through some really great examples and demos. But within Adobe Analytics, Adobe for a very long time has had something called Adobe Workspace. And if you look at the setup of Workspace versus Explorations, you can pretty easily see that there's a lot of similarities between these two platforms. So because of this, actually, when you start learning Google Analytics, or if you've already been using Adobe, a lot of the knowledge around how you do analysis in either platform is going to be similar to how you do it in the other platform now. And this means that for a lot of us kind of in the marketing or analytics world, we can start looking at some of the key differentiators or kind of the unique features in each. And there's going to be lots of opportunities for potential overlap, or even using both platforms or one or the other, or kind of any combination in between. So with that, what we're going to do today is Debbie is going to take us through an interactive demo. We're going to explain kind of the basics of Adobe Analytics, kind of give you a walkthrough of how companies and organizations use it. As we go through, we're going to cover some really unique features that you can only get within Adobe Analytics, and we're going to start to show off some of the key capabilities. And then, as I mentioned, as we go through, if you have questions or there's other things you'd like to see, definitely feel free to enter those in the chat as we go through. So with that, I'm going to hand off the presenter role to Debbie, and we're going to go through a few key areas of the product. So Debbie's going to walk us through the workspace. We're going to go through some examples of how we do analysis around content, as well as attribution. And then we're going to talk about some other kind of net new and unique features around segmentation. We'll talk about calculated metrics, which is one of my favorite. And then we'll also start to layer on some of the flexible nature of that. So with that, Debbie, why don't you kick us off?
All right, well, great. Thanks, Charles. I'm really delighted to be able to provide everyone with an Adobe Analytics overview today. The end game for any analytics platform is to use the information to make data-driven decisions, to analyze your data, to glean useful information, which you can then use to make informed decisions, to get from the business questions to answers. You need to visualize your data to make it easier to identify patterns, trends, and outliers in large data sets, and to bring your data to life, really, so that you can better communicate your insights. And then lastly, you need to democratize your data to make it accessible to the average end user, to allow non-specialists to be able to gather and analyze data without requiring outside help. So let's dive into Workspace to see how Adobe helps you to those ends. First, you'll want to create your Workspace project, and you can either create a project from scratch, or you can start with a template. There's a number of out-of-the-box templates that are available where with just a few selections, you've got a good start on your project. Or your company can save any project that they've created as a template for future use across the organization. Now, I'm not going to start a project here. I'm going to go ahead and jump into my demo report. Whenever you start any project, you start with a panel. Now, a project is really just a report, and it can be as long with as many panels or as small and short as you want it to be. But you're going to start with the panel over here on the left. So you can start with a blank panel if you want to. Panels are the canvas of your project. So you can use a blank panel, or you can select again from one of the out-of-the-box templates for quick customizable insights, which allow you to again make just a couple of selections and get instant information curated for you. Within panels, you drop visualizations, and you can see there's a number of visualizations that are available to you, all of which are drag and drop. So this is the panel, and these are the visualizations. Then within visualizations, you add components. And components, these are your dimensions, which describe your metrics, which count, your segments, which act as kind of a data filter, and customizable date ranges, which time box for either individual or comparison date ranges. Now, I don't want to leave this left panel without showing you real quickly that you can control the settings at the project level. So this top part is pretty basic, but at the bottom, you can change the view density so that your tables are more compact and you get more rows within each table so you can quickly get deeper and more analysis. Additionally, this fun part, which I really like, is the ability to customize your color palette at the project level. So if you need to cut out any of these or screen capture any of your visualizations and drop them into a PowerPoint, they'll meet with your brand guidelines. So that's fun. So when you start with a panel, let's just drag a panel over here and start with a panel. The first thing that you do is you select your data source. Each panel has its own data source. And reports in Workspace, as you can see, can have multiple panels, and each panel can have a separate data source. So you can have side-by-side panels with different data sources, all within the same report. Again, when you start your panel, here again are those out-of-the-box templates for quick curation of both visualizations and metrics. But we're going to start with a freeform table because one of the primary tools in analysis are data tables. You can create your data table in one of two ways. You can either enable the table builder, which allows you to drag and drop dimensions and metrics, and yet Adobe Analytics does not render the data yet. So you can drag and drop and create your table without rendering the data yet until you push build. Or you can just drag and drop your dimensions and your metrics, and you can see how quickly and easily it is to absolutely get these things rendered really quickly. With tables, dimensions can be either columns or they can be either columns or rows. And you can break down dimensions with other dimensions by simply drag and drop. You can add dimensions across the top for more of a cross-tab look if you want to. So I'm going to drag and drop mobile device type underneath my entries. So now I've got a cross-tab view in just a couple of clicks on my table. Another primary piece of your data that you want to analyze is attribution. I'm going to drag and drop another panel over, and I'm going to drag and drop an attribution panel over. Of course, marketing channel is the most common attribution data point that marketers and product owners focus on. But what about other dimensions or activities on the site? For example, how often does your site search contribute to completed orders? With Adobe Analytics, you can analyze any dimension and its contribution to events that are important to your business. So I might select call to action clicks, and I might be interested in which of my content categories across my website are contributing to these CTA clicks. I can select various attribution models. So you can see last touch, first touch. You can even create a custom attribution model if you wanted to. And then I can select my look back window. It can be clearly time blocked, or it can be visitor, or I can make it custom. And with a simple click, now I've built my attribution model across all of my various website sections.
So as Debbie's showing, we're already like seeing some really unique things within Adobe. So I'm going to cover just a few of my favorites that she hit on. First was those date ranges. So one of the challenges that I found in some other platforms is the date ranges like can't necessarily be customized for unique kind of business cycles. So let's say you had a fiscal year that wasn't like the traditional January to December, or you had even certain campaign windows. Maybe you had a Black Friday window, you had a back to school window. Within Adobe, you can actually pick and curate different date ranges and then make them sticky across your projects or the organization. So effectively, you can create your own calendars, which is really powerful. Additionally, another component that Debbie is showing here is that this concept of attribution is very different. Like within Google Analytics, as an example, there's some very powerful attribution features, but almost everything is really scoped to doing attribution at a channel or a campaign or some sort of campaign attribute. Within Adobe, that attribution panel lets you do attribution of anything. So one of my biggest challenges has been like content and understanding how content is leading to outcomes. So if you wanted to understand what pages are leading to someone filling out a form on your B2B site, or if you're doing an e-commerce purchase, what are the categories or what are the assets that are leading to that outcome? It can be kind of very difficult or challenging to kind of do that sort of analysis in other tools. Where in Adobe, everything can kind of mix together from the schema perspective. So the attribution report she's showing here is letting you use kind of all of these flexible attribution models, and you can easily bring in your content and have the outcomes kind of participated. So this is definitely one of my favorite areas of the product. And another fun kind of part of Adobe, this is kind of leading us to a different part in the platform. It's very common for lots of different organizations to tag their marketing campaigns differently. So Debbie, there's kind of two different ways within Adobe that we can bring in kind of campaign information. One way is you can actually set up Adobe to bring in UTMs, like if you're already using Google UTM parameters. But another example is a concept around campaign IDs. So it's kind of one of my things I've never liked about campaign tagging is how it makes URLs look, because they add all these different attributes. The URLs can get very long. They're also not pretty. And additionally, with where our industry is going, with trying to maybe make things more secure or more private, sometimes the campaign attributes might be displaying information that you might not necessarily want to be showing all the users or your competitors or things like that. So Adobe has a concept called classifications. Debbie, can you talk a little bit about the classification and how that can potentially provide additional attribution support?
Absolutely. So classification is previously known as Saint uploads, and it allows you to upload your external data and use it to either categorize or classify and report alongside your analytics data. So consider Charles's point about UTM parameters. They muddy up the URL quite a bit, and you may want to just have a unique campaign ID in the URL and then use the classification importer to upload that identification, that campaign ID, alongside the actual UTM parameters, and then you can break it out in your Adobe Analytics with the campaign ID, UTM, source, medium, and campaign. Additionally, you might want to upload your cost data from that campaign so that you can then get to a true return on ad spend if you've uploaded at the campaign your cost data. So all of that information, as long as you have a common thread amongst your analytics data and the data that you're uploading, you can break it down and further classify and then report alongside it within your Adobe Analytics platform.
Yeah, and there's two key parts of that. One, the campaign ID can be widened. And what I like about Adobe is that you're not necessarily limited to just a few different dimensions. You can widen it to as many dimensions as you need. And also it's fully retroactive. So as you're kind of defining that ID and the attributes that tie to it, if you need to change things over time, everything can apply on a fully retroactive basis. And then you can create all sorts of definitions and groupings and other sorts of granularity. So to kind of summarize this section on attribution, it's super powerful because you have all sorts of opportunities to bring the information in whatever level of granularity you want. And then additionally, the flexible nature of it, the attribution can actually apply to anything you're doing. So there's big benefits for the content that we just talked about. Another one is e-commerce. There's going to be lots of flexibility to do like merchandising and different levels of granularity there. So I think that's some great stuff on the attribution. So Debbie, keep talking and taking us through some other stuff.
So channel performance, I mean, attribution is primarily how marketers are familiar with attribution, and improvement does depend on measurement. Your marketing organization works really hard for each visit and conversion. And so it's really important to understand how those channels are performing in order to ensure your marketing spend is in the right place and that you can make adjustments as needed. In addition to the out-of-the-box attribution panel and the ability to modify the attribution directly in your visualization, Adobe allows very extensive rules-based definitions around your marketing channels so that you can very customize your channel attribution specifically to your organization. You can get very deep into which order in which the attribution should apply, your paid channels at the top and your earned channels at the bottom. If you have custom shopping channels or other things like that, you can customize your attribution and your marketing into those buckets within Adobe Analytics. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was segmentation. Segmentation is a significant differentiator within Adobe. You'll notice there's a number of out-of-the-box segments that Adobe Analytics provides. Excuse me. Or you can create your own custom segments. Segments can be sequential. So you might, for example, want to understand, let's go in this one. You can create your own segment and make them sequential. You might want to understand, I'm dragging a segment over in and using a segment in segments. So you might want to know within how many visits or how much time a visitor viewed your blog page and then came back in and converted on your site. So you can make those sequential using then within X number of visits or weeks or sessions. And you can create segments to have a view of how different collections of people behave on your site. Segments can be used as a drop-down filter. Let me just cancel out of here. So segments can be used as a drop-down filter on one or all of your panels. They can also be limited to just this workspace, or you can share them across the organization. And again, with multiple drag and drop, adding a segment to a panel is just as easy as picking the segments, hitting Shift to make them all options. And now I can have all of these segments across the organization, or that I have set for my organization, available in this particular component. So they're very, very easy to add, a true differentiator between other platforms in my view. Lastly, there's a panel which allows you to compare segments. For example, you may want to compare visitors to your mobile app against visitors to your online store and see how they behave differently. Calculated metrics are another key differentiator, and they can be created without ever leaving your workspace. So I'm going to close this panel down and we'll look at some calculated metrics. So again, they can be created specifically just to your report suite, just to this workspace, excuse me, or across the entire organization. Calculated metrics allow you to customize your KPI measurements to fit just your organization. For example, in this view, you may want to create an AOV specific to online and call center assisted orders. So I can, with a couple of clicks, highlight these two fields, for example, right click, and create a metric from this selection. So I'm going to divide, and you can see with just 2 clicks, I've already created the AOV for call center. But this is not showing up as dollars, so I just want to quickly edit this. So I'm going to edit it in place, and I'm just going to name this call center AOV. I need it to be currency, and I can make it available across the entire organization or just keep it in this particular project. Save it. And now I've got a quick calculated metric, and I never even had to leave my project. I can see that the call center AOV is much higher than the online AOV. So if this were chat, for example, I may want to pop chat up sooner, since I know that chat assisted orders have a much higher average order value. Last of all, as we're looking at our projects, let's take a look at virtual report suites. Often organizations will write all of their data into a roll-up or a parent report suite. And within Adobe Analytics, you can then create what's called a virtual report suite to curate dimensions and metrics together, and with a permanent segment applied, say to separate each of your respective brands or to isolate your mobile app. Or you might even want to create a virtual report suite for your different regions, APAC, EMEA, and the Americas. Virtual report suites are also a valuable tool in managing user-level permissions. You might create a campaign-based virtual report suite and permission the agency running that campaign to just view that data. Virtual report suites also either reduces or removes the necessity for secondary server calls, which is a paid-for feature of Adobe Analytics. One thing though, virtual report suites are not available for segmentation in personalization or target. That's done at the source report suite for that. And then last of all, let's talk about sharing. So you can share your, oh, excuse me, jump in, Charles.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if we go back to virtual report suites, I think there's a few things just to reiterate with this. Like, this is a really important feature. There's certain tools that don't even really have a concept of kind of views or this kind of curated segmented data. And within Adobe, there's a few things that are really interesting about this feature. So first, when you create this virtual report suite, as Debbie's showing, basically you have a collection of data, and at any time you can create these report suites for just your blog, just your e-commerce, just for certain segments of your traffic. And one key differentiator is they're fully retroactive. So a lot of other tools, when you create things, they're only work point in time forward. Lots of things, like almost everything within Adobe, especially that we've been showing today, are all fully retroactive, which is huge, right? Because within lots of organizations, like let's say you want to spin up that kind of unique set of data for just that marketing campaign you're running, or for that section of your website, maybe because you have a new marketing team dedicated towards it, you can create and curate all that data, and it's fully retroactive. Another thing I really like, again, is as Debbie kind of mentioned, there's no additional cost for these virtual report suites. They're all included, so they're very powerful from that perspective. So, and to highlight another theme around that, the collaboration and the sharing is just so critical, because it's very easy within Adobe to curate experiences so you're not overwhelming the end user. You can curate this experience at any level, and it's not just like they're seeing a report, but all the assets behind it can also be curated. So a lot of other tools, like when you share assets, sometimes you're either sharing with an individual user or all users, and those are kind of the only options. Where in Adobe, you have all sorts of flexibility. So you can start curating assets for different teams of users. You can curate them within the report itself. And then in addition, with the level of permissions, you can give users different permissions where they can edit, they can do the analysis on it, but it starts to allow you to kind of easily curate that experience where you can have that executive overview report, you can have deep dives, you can give users the ability to go in and edit everything. And of course, you can set up different dashboards and stuff outside, which we can touch on a little bit. But I think the asset and the curation and the permissioning is really a huge differentiator within it. And there's other things like for enterprises like SSO and other stuff that also can come into play and be really important. So go ahead, Debbie, keep going.
That was actually the end of my presentation. When he talks about sharing, again, you can share the date ranges across the organization or to specific people. You can share segments across the organization within Workspace reports or to specific people. So when he talks about the sharing, it's not just the sharing of the reports, but it is all of the customizations across it as well. One final thing across within the sharing is that you can send this file. You can send it as a PDF or as a CSV. You can send it on a schedule. You can pick the schedule. Let's say you've got your week is Saturday to Sunday, or your week is Monday to Sunday. You can set the day, you can set the time, the frequency, and any number of folks. Now, the recipients don't have to have their own Adobe Analytics login. You can just set it to anybody that needs to be sent. A couple of other really quick things that I wanted to cover within the components are, we've talked about segments, calculated metrics, and date ranges, but I'd like to talk to you about alerts as well. Adobe has what's called Sensei, which is a built-in anomaly detection. So I'm going to right-click. Please know that in Adobe Analytics, right-click is where the magic is. And I'm going to go ahead and trend this selection. So I'm trending page views over the time frame, the time frame that I have set up. And notice this dark line, the shaded line in the background. That is Adobe Sensei anomaly detection, showing us that, for example, on September 10th, our page views, there was fell 75% below what was expected. So I can, with one click in here, and it will allow me to analyze why that anomaly happened. The other thing you can do is you can also use that right click and you can create an alert from this particular section. So if there's a custom event or an important metric that you're tracking on your site, you can create an alert. And if that particular metric dips below, if there's an anomaly, dips below a particular threshold, this is using the Sensei, the built-in Sensei, or if you know for a fact that your checkouts never dip below 500 in any 1 hour, you can set that and it will send an SMS alert to anybody that you ask, and as well it can send an email. So you might want to alert your product owner, your development teams. It could be that there's an issue with the site or there's an issue with your tracking, but you'll get these alerts. And again, you can set it at the granularity at hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. So again, a really very powerful built-in feature of Adobe Analytics.
We're getting quite a few questions on the next thing in that dropdown. Can you talk a little bit about annotations and what those are within Adobe?
Absolutely. So we just talked about alerts. You can annotate the data so that in these trend lines, you can also create an annotation so that if you have a big, if you've broken to sale, for example, and there's a big spike or something, you can create an annotation that shows up in any of these trend lines to provide contextual information around anomalous behavior, whether high or low. There may have been, a site down, or you may have broken to sale, or you want to compare year-over-year metrics, and so you would put last year's time frame and this year's time frame, both in annotations across, and they would display in the trend line.
Yep, so that was another recent addition within Adobe where annotations are now fully supported. So you can add them, and then any users that are doing the analysis and accessing those date frames will have access to those annotations. And I think that's such a critical feature because when you have larger teams, or even if you have a small team, whenever there's change within the stakeholders, it's always common that you're always going to have those anomalies, right? You're going to have those increases and decreases. And without the ability to add the annotation, it just inevitably means that at some point someone else is going to ask the same question of why there was a change there. And you can save yourself and your organization substantial amounts of time by just being able to finish your analysis and add a note for what was the outcome. And that way everyone has access to those. So I think with that, we've done a really kind of good overview of Adobe Analytics. I wanted to touch on the questions that we're starting to get, and also I wanted to lightly touch on another part of Adobe called Customer Journey Analytics. And this is a really unique area where I think it's worth just spending a minute or two. And we're actually going to do another webinar on what Adobe calls CJA next month. If I do my 2-minute overview, CJA is like the next generation of Adobe Analytics capabilities. It's a tool where Adobe's basically taking Workspace. And as Debbie just showed, Workspace is amazingly powerful. Adobe's had it for a very long time, and you can do all sorts of really advanced stuff within it. Within Customer Journey Analytics, Adobe is basically taking Workspace and adding even more functionality and power behind it. So hopefully this loads in just a second. But the CJA product, one of the biggest components is that Adobe Analytics is basically tied to, you have to use the Adobe kind of SDKs or the Adobe data model to feed it data. Adobe kind of asked this question: what if you could send any data to Adobe Analytics? And that's, for me, really what the backbone of CJA is. It is a tool that's basically taking Adobe Analytics and allowing you to input any data into the tool, and then giving you that front end to then analyze all that data without necessarily needing to, write SQL for everything or do all this complicated data joins and data ingestion, but it can really make it accessible to kind of your broader team. So in this example, we're actually using Adobe Workspace inside CJA to connect to Google Analytics, Firebase, as well as call center data. And this effectively means that we can use Adobe Analytics on top of GA. So for many organizations, Google Analytics is always going to have a really important role to play with Google Media. So if you're analyzing Google Ads and other kind of Google Media assets, there's lots of kind of unique integrations within GA. And then within Adobe, there's lots of unique features that we showed you today, where you can kind of do this freeform attribution, you have this kind of flexible retroactive nature, and there's this new world where you can potentially have a single data source. It can even be GA, and then you can basically run Adobe Analytics on top of kind of this universal component. So we're going to be doing another demo on this other product called CJA next month, so you can stay tuned for that. But with that, let's go to the questions and see what we have. So a few questions on recordings. We're definitely going to be sharing the recording. Mindy asked a question: does Adobe require a lot of developer overhead for setting up tags? So that's a great question. So Adobe has their own tag management system called Adobe Launch. Just like within Google, generally everything is more efficient if you use like Google Tag Manager or Google Tech. Adobe's kind of a similar component where things are going to probably be better in the long term if you can do as much as possible within Adobe Launch or Adobe's native tools. However, there's lots of additional options. One example that I really like is Adobe actually launched an extension for Adobe launch, I think about 6 months ago. And it's actually a Google data layer extension. So if your organization has already invested in like using the Google Tag Manager data layer, what this extension does is it can actually use Adobe's launch, use your existing data layer extension, and allow you to map everything without needing to retag your website. So to answer your question, there's lots of options within Adobe to minimize that developer overhead, especially if you already have a good implementation of another tool, like say an Amplitude or something else. It's pretty easy to either run it within the other tag management system. So you could use Telium, you could use GTM, or you can even use Adobe Launch, and that's showing the flexible nature of the product. It can actually ingest other schemas and provide other options for that. So with that, we said, let's see what other questions. There is a question about, can we apply segments to all the panels? Debbie, is there an easy option to apply segments across panels, or do you have to do it one at a time?
I was just going to ask that question or answer that question. If you want to apply the same segment to all of the visualizations, the whole point of having panels is to allow you to have different report suites within those separate panels. If you're working with separate report suites, you may not want to apply those segments. It's all drag and drop. There isn't a way to apply a specific segment across all the panels. You can, however, apply the date range across all the panels. So that you can do with a single dropdown. But if you wanted to apply the same segment to multiple panels, you would need to drag and drop that. Or again, if you wanted to apply the same segment to all your visualizations, you would just have all those visualizations in the same panel.
Let's see. I have a question about the data structure in Adobe. In Universal Analytics, we have hits, sessions, users, and products. In GA4, we have events, users, and items. What about Adobe? Can you explain that in maybe 2 words? Adobe, Debbie, any comments on the Adobe data model?
The Adobe data model can be, it's mapped more closely to GA4 than to Universal Analytics. But in Adobe, a session is a visit, a user is a unique visitor. The events, when you set up your implementation, all the custom events are all customizable. There are, of course, out of the box metrics that you use, but all of those events are custom to your organization. So I think it's very similar in that way. But again, it's much more similar to GA4 than it is to Universal Analytics.
Yep, and that goes back to our intro. One major difference though is, again, that flexibility. So one thing I really like about Adobe is, as an example, GA4 or Universal and a lot of other tools don't support arrays. So if you wanted to do an array, like you had maybe like a page load and there's a list of blog articles that are shown on the page. Well, maybe you wanted to track like which articles were actually impressed and did they see, and you might be showing like 5 articles like in a carousel or something. Google, like as an example, has really only ever allowed you to do arrays for e-commerce. So there was lots of like customizations or workarounds you could explore, but in Adobe, you can use arrays for anything. So there's actually list attributes you can use. So if you're not an e-commerce site, there's lots of opportunities to do that impression. And then when we start layering in those calculated metrics and other components, you can really kind of make it a first party experience for all those assets and components within there. There was a question if we could do a webinar on Adobe Launch. We can definitely do that. So we can schedule that and send you some information on that. There was another question about how does Adobe handle multiple website consolidation for CBA. I'm not sure what CBA stands for. But Adobe at a high level has all sorts of flexibility, and that's going to come into that combination of report suites and virtual report suites that Debbie was showing. So depending on your particular organization's needs for governance, there's very easy ways to roll things up as well as to keep them separate or to do both. And then again, I think a really unique differentiator is those virtual report suites are included and they're fully retroactive. So if you have everything kind of organized at a roll-up level, it's very easy to then consolidate and handle any needs that change over time because of that flexible nature of virtual report suites. Saren asked, or go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Lily asks a question about virtual report suites, and the question is, if we want virtual report suites to be more team-based, can the marketing channels tied to the virtual report suite be edited, or will those rules come from the main parent report suite? And you're absolutely right. The marketing channel rules live with the parent report suite, and they're inherited from the parent report suite. However, you can decide which of those, you can select those within the virtual report suite. So you could create a segment of just those marketing channels that you wanted to include in the virtual report suite and create them that way from a team-based perspective.
Perfect. Saren's asking, how old is this customer journey analytics that I just mentioned? Is it still under heavy development, and is it a relatively new product? So CJA is relatively new. It's been around for the past few years. However, I think the one of the key differences between what Adobe's doing and some other providers is Adobe Analytics isn't going anywhere. And CJA can actually work with Adobe Analytics or work without it. So this is, again, an example of Adobe providing tons of flexibility. So right now, and we'll cover this in our webinar in the coming weeks, it's very common for lots of Adobe customers to either be using Adobe Analytics or actually using both Adobe and CJA. And CJA, I have some really great documentations on the differences between CJA and Adobe Analytics. Adobe is still working on releasing lots of features and updates and other stuff. So in the coming months or years, there will be options for using CJA as a fully standalone tool. But right now, there are some things to think about as you're thinking whether you use that or Adobe or both, and how that might work with your existing Google tools as well. There's a question about how in Adobe Analytics can you basically do a cross-channel attribution? So this is a question where he's saying, Omar, when he's in Google Analytics, each visit only has one source. How in Adobe Analytics can you have multiple sources? So I actually think this is something that both Google and Adobe can do now. Within GA4, Google has a new event scoped, so you can actually have multiple traffic sources at a visit or a user, because it's actually at the event level now. And Adobe has always had that. So there is some similarity now within both products for that. There's a question from Katan. How within Adobe can we get data into a data warehouse? Debbie, do you want to touch on data feeds for a second?
I would love to. There's two ways to do it. You can either query directly against the data warehouse, and Charles, if you wanted to go into Adobe, you could show that. You can query directly against the data warehouse. That's one way. You can use a tool called Report Builder, which is an API directly between Excel and the data warehouse. So you can pull your data directly into Excel without ever even having to open up Adobe Analytics. Or lastly, there's data feeds that can be hourly, daily, weekly feeds that you set up and that you can deliver to whatever FTP or cloud platform that you need.
Yep, so these data feeds are super powerful. One thing that I like about this is the hourly nature. So for most of our clients, their data is actually available even basically after midnight within an hour. So if you're starting to process your like daily tables, they're very instant, and there's other solutions where sometimes those tables might show up, you know, halfway through the following day. So with an Adobe, you can have it as basically as quickly as an hour within that following day. Let's see, other questions. I lost my Q&A panel. Where did it go?
Jude is asking, how do we build funnels in Adobe Analytics reports? Funnels are one of the out-of-the-box options in terms of visualizations. So you can drag and drop, again, funnels within Adobe Analytics. You can drag and drop any number of dimensions. So if you want to go over to the visualization panel.
Yep.
So fallout would be what you would consider the funnel. So you can go up, it's a little bit higher, there you go. So you can use segments, you can use pages as your fallout. Again, it's very, very, I guess, in-depth in terms of all the various things that you can use when it comes to the fallout.
So these fallouts, again, are super powerful. You can add segments, you can add all your touch points. They're very flexible. And another simple example is you can change the color palette of them, which is actually very nice, again, when you're copying those visualizations into your reports.
Exactly. You can do comparisons. You can do year-over-year comparisons within these panels as well. So you could do, again, if you Black Friday or holiday, or if you've broken to sale, you can do those comparisons year-over-year by combining your segments, your customized date ranges, and your fallout panel.
All right, so just a few last questions. One was, how do we access specific workspaces from a list? So one simple example of that is, like, in this panel, there's a drop down over here, and you can pick whatever report suite or virtual report suite you want. And just to highlight again what Debbie showed earlier, each panel can access its own report suites. So if you're trying to work across different report suites, you can actually do that all within one report, or just work with your single report. So it's, again, showing kind of that ultimate flexibility you have within it. There's another question on, are there direct connectors between Power BI? There absolutely is. There's also lots of options, as Debbie was mentioning, to get data into Excel if you like that. And with that, I think we handled most of the questions. We'll try and follow up on anything that was unanswered via email. So with that, we'd like to just thank everyone for joining our webinar. We have some additional resources that we'll be sending you, as well as the recording. We're going to be doing additional webinars on Launch, Adobe Target. We'll be doing one on the CJA, again, that we're sharing. So you can look up for that follow-up information. Additionally, if you have any questions or you're looking for help, don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. We'll have some contact info as well. But with that, we'd like to just thank you all for joining us and hope you have a great rest of your day. So cheers, everyone.